I'm going to talk a little later about racism and, excuse me, about stress and racism. But before that, I want to do some definitional work with racism, particularly colorblind racism. And I like this photo because I think it is really at the heart of the problem with colorblindness. That is, colorblind people think that they're, espousing a a way of life that is race neutral, but what they don't see is that in fact there is color in the world and they are not addressing the problems. Discriminatory. So if we think about old-fashioned racism, racism 1.0, a colleague of mine, Tim Wise, said used this analogy. Software, when it comes out, software has a number on it, and when it upgrades and get better, they give it a new number. So Microsoft 1.0, Microsoft 15.5. So if you think of it, old-fashioned racism is racism 1.0. And in that racism, you have an overt belief in white superiority. And because of that belief, people actually promoted segregation either through laws or de facto. That is, when blacks moved in the neighborhoods, whites would move out. And people believed in the biological basis for the intellectual, for what they considered to be an intellectual inferiority. Old-fashioned racism started with slavery and continued all the way through the civil rights era. With the civil rights era, it became unacceptable and continues to be unacceptable to profess to be an old-fashioned racist. And so what has happened is that racism hasn't gone away, it's just evolved into this colorblind racism. And in fact, since the election of Obama, it has become more overtly the theme of the day. We avoid racial terminology. We we just went through the UN conference on racism where the United States refused to go and the networks did not cover it. We increasingly covert racial discourses and practices. And whites' claims of experiencing reverse discrimination is sort of this colorblind racism. Discrimination is discrimination is discrimination in their terminology, and they see no difference between correcting doing things to correct the harm that was done to a group versus uh, uh, doing things to overtly subjugate a group. And so we find an almost complete avoidance of direct racial references in political matters. Um, and so what has happened is that the mechanism of racial inequality is becoming more and more invisible to everyone's eye. And this is very hard and very dangerous. It means that it will be harder to deal with and address colorblind racism than it was to deal with old-fashioned racism. So here's Here's an example of a conservative color blindness. Conservative color blindness believes that racial hierarchy is legally irrelevant to the constitutional principle of equal protection, and so they never want to use racial hierarchy unless, of course, it's state sponsored, it's conscious discrimination that is intentional, and it is the proximate cause of the harm. They want to do nothing to correct racial disparities except to convince marginalized groups to adopt the proper value system so that they may take advantage of the new blind landscape. A clear proponent of this is Justice Clarence Thomas. And I use African Americans to exemplify colorblindness because colorblindness is not about the race of the person. Uh, Blacks can have colorblind philosophy just as quickly as whites. And if we're not careful about that, we will think that we have adopted someone who is going to take on racial disparities in a race conscious way, and that is not going to happen because of their color blindness. And in fact, I think that has happened. I think the example of liberal color blindness is President Barack Obama. Liberal color blindness says, oh, race does matter, but not much. President Obama said that, oh, we have gotten 90% of what needs to be done about race done. We only have 10% of the way to go. They're willing under some conditions to be race sensitive, but very limited. When you look at President Obama's economic stimulus package, and when you look at his budget package, what you will see is that he has some money in that is specifically identified for HBCUs, and he has some money identified for American Indians. But other than those categories, he does nothing in his plan to assure that there will be a race conscious approach to dealing with the economic crisis. And so that goes his limited race system sensitive in a very limited way. Liberal colorblind people views frontal attack on racial condition as divisive. President Obama has said that over and over again. And I believe that the fundamental reason that the United States did not attend the World Conference Against Racism, Durban II, was because of President Obama's unwillingness to engage on a discussion of racism on a global stage, because he believes that those kind of discussions are divisive. Finally, liberal colorblindness try to convince the racially marginalized groups to adopt the proper cultural values so that they may take advantage of the new race-blind landscape. President Barack Obama has said several times. First, he has constantly referred to the civil rights people born of the civil rights era as being old, outdated, and angry, unnecessary anger in this new landscape. He refers to himself as the Jeremiah. He attempts to convince us that there's a new racial landscape. During his election, he talked about it. He talked about it without using the word race, he talked about this new landscape, this new that civil rights era, where people of the civil rights era people was people of the past, and that his generation came in less not angry at all. He has he on several different occasions he uh, ex- he extorted black people to adopt the appropriate cultural values, to be better fathers, to value education more, to stop being xenophobic. And in fact, in one national interview, he called the black community anti Semitic. In another national interview, he called the black community xenophobic. In a speech before a church, he called the black community xenophobic, anti-Semitic, uh, and and the important point is not that he called the black community that by itself, is that he didn't, in fact, call out the white community on anti-black racism. And so what I see in President Obama is liberal colored blindness. And I think that it's going to be very important to watch him during, and not just watch, to engage him during his presidency to adopt race conscious remedies.